So it's always a little bit dangerous to have an academic in the end of the panel. But however, also Andrew, I would introduce you. You're the Professor of Company Law and Corporate Governance at the School of Law at the University of Sheffield. That's the formal title. But more interesting is that you're working in a project on sustainable companies. So we would learn from you, from this perspective, how you assess what you heard and what you see in the papers and the political proposals. So Andrew, you have the floor.
I'd like to begin by saying thank you to the S&D group for inviting me, and begin with an apology for being the only presenter to inflict PowerPoints on you at this stage of the proceedings. So my remarks today are based on a commentary on the Shareholder Rights Directive, which is available on the table, which was put together by me in cooperation with Frank Bold, but with input from sustainable companies from Oslo and also from various French colleagues who are detailed there. I'd begin with some introductory remarks about the shareholder-centric approach which is being adopted, and I'll then move on to some more specific comments about the proposed directive and make a few suggestions for minor changes, and then I'm going to wrap up with a broader perspective on how we can encourage long-termism in corporate governance. So I'd just like to begin by expressing firm support for the goals of this directive, for saying that long-termism in corporate governance is the single most important thing that we can be aiming for. But I'd like to emphasize that the Commission's approach to improving corporate governance relies exclusively on shareholder empowerment. It aims for effective and sustainable shareholder engagement. That's preamble paragraph 8. And I don't think there's any problem in encouraging shareholder engagement. But on its own, there is no evidence that shareholder empowerment will improve corporate governance and lead to longer-term horizons. Paragraph 8 of the preamble to the directive also refers to checks and balances between different stakeholders, but there's nothing in this directive. Now that's not a problem, but it's something that I will return to in my concluding comments. So in terms of shareholder empowerment, why focus solely on shareholders? There's a persistent myth that shareholders are the owners of companies, but it's well established in academic literature and in law across all the member states that shareholders are not the owners of companies. Corporations, companies are distinct legal entities, and they're not owned by anybody, including their shareholders. And this is a really important point. This is true as a matter of law, and this means that the policy options, the policy avenues, are not closed off by a property rights argument. Shareholders do not own corporations, therefore they are not the only ones who should exercise control over the time horizons adopted by management. Looking beyond shareholders, we find groups like employees and creditors. They, like shareholders, have contractual relationships with the company, and they also have certain rights. Many stakeholder groups are dependent on and have an economic interest in the company's long-term survival. So the question is, why do we not allow these groups to have input into the processes that determine the long-term interests of the company? This is what I'm going to return to at the end. So now for sort of the middle part of my presentation, I'm just going to talk quickly about the most important provisions of the directive. So first of all, the provisions identifying shareholders, that's Articles 3A and 3B. This is going to allow companies to communicate directly with their institutional shareholders. The first question that arises here is, will institutional investors who've delegated investment to asset managers actually incur further costs of engaging directly with companies? That's a question which makes us wonder about this provision. I also know, and I know that some people in the room have already suggested they won't agree with this, but many institutional investors are under pressure to meet short-term liabilities. We are several years into a zero interest rate experiment. Investors are chasing yield. Shareholders are a broad church, we heard, but what I want to know is where will the pressure for a long-term approach come from? I'm firmly in favour of this communication channel. Opening up communication channels between companies and the end beneficiaries, the ultimate shareholders, is a good idea. And what I would suggest here is you could use that communication channel to allow other groups, in particular employees, to express their views on pay practices and long-termism through this channel. This would not be difficult, and I'm going to come back to that as a concrete proposal. Next up, proposal on improving institutional investor engagement. Now, this is the one that I come to as the most sceptical, coming from the UK. This provision assumes that if we impose a comply or explain obligation on institutional investors, this will lead to greater engagement. And again, I say, where will the pressure come from? The UK has tried this since 2002. We've been using soft law since 2002. Institutional Shareholders Committee statement of that year. We turned this into comply or explain in 2009, and in 2010 we introduced the Stewardship Code. This has not fostered long-termism. Nobody could accuse the UK of being at the vanguard of long-term corporate governance. We need more than disclosure here. We need incentives for shareholders to hold shares long term. We need mechanisms which will release short-term pressure. We need mechanisms which will create better incentives to intervene, and I'll come back to those at the end. Okay, next one. Improving asset manager engagement. Again, we're assuming that transparency will create the positive incentives. I wonder, will end beneficiaries really look at the terms on which their pension funds are engaging asset managers and ask those investment managers to change those terms? I don't think that Article 3G is overly burdensome. I don't think it's a huge cost. I think the extra information is useful and used by civil society, creating greater accountability. But I don't see it as being key. The key provision of the directive is the next one, which is the say on pay. This is definitely the most important provision of this directive. And it's the most important provision of this directive because incorrectly aligned management incentives, justified by shareholder value arguments, have been associated with corporate failures since Enron, social costs throughout the 21st century, and most recently with the financial crisis and the enormous costs of that. Now, the US and the UK experience with advisory votes on, say, or on pay suggests that pay practices may not change. And again, to emphasise, shareholder voting alone will not result in contracts which align directors' incentives with the long-term interests of the company. The problem here is that economists have been telling us for the last 40 years that there is a perfect incentive contract out there. We just have to find it. We've been looking for 40 years. We've suffered Enron. We've suffered the financial crisis. We're still looking for it. I wonder when we'll realise that in practice that incentive contract cannot be found. So again, here, should we not be looking at other stakeholder groups who have a long-term interest in the company to have input into how these incentive contracts are drafted? Would we consider employee representation on remuneration committees? That's one thing that we might consider. Okay. So now a few kind of light touch changes to the directive that we might consider. We might consider including, before the current preamble 2, a statement that shareholders do not own publicly listed companies. This would be debunking the myth which dominates most public debate about shareholder involvement in companies. Next up, for the small font, we might want to add in preamble 2 a statement that capital market pressure creates great short-term pressures, encourages companies to engage in financial engineering, share buybacks, all just for the purpose of keeping the share price high. The next one, we might want to add to preamble 15 that we want remuneration policies that use a broader range of criteria, financial and non-financial criteria, economic, social and governance indicators. Next up, And I think this one's important. Article 9A requires companies to disclose the ratio between the average pay of directors and the average pay of employees. The term director needs to be defined in the directive as meaning an executive director of a company. If we take account of the pay given to non-executive directors, the ratio will be much, much lower. It's executive directors who are given what we call high-powered incentives. It's executive directors who get paid exponential bonuses for raising the share price, whatever that does to the long-term interests of the company. So this is a really important amendment. And then finally, we might suggest that employees should be entitled via their representatives to express a view on pay ratios. This would use the channels created by Articles 3A and 3B to allow employees to suggest to shareholders whether they think managerial incentives are truly aligned with the long-term interests of the company. And so, to wrap up, am I running over? No? Okay, so I'm going to wrap up by sketching out an alternative approach, and we do this in a bit more detail in the commentary. To begin with, perhaps the most simple, we should give shareholders incentives to hold shares for longer time periods. We could make changes to voting rights that increase with time. We could reduce voting rights each time shares are transferred. We could, as my French colleagues advised me, use accounting standards and prudential norms to create pressure within company balance sheets for longer-term holdings. That's the first proposal. It's not unduly complex, although it may require implementation in different national systems. We may consider changes to stock options. The European Parliament drove the changes to the Capital Requirements Directive. We may consider changes to stock options, but this is part of a much bigger and broader debate that we need to have about what companies are for, whose interests they serve. The next one, we should allow companies to specify long-term purposes and lock them into the constitutional documents to enable them to resist pressures for short-term performance, short-term payouts to shareholders. Next, and drawing on the research of the Sustainable Companies Project in Oslo, we should change the law to create a clearer statement of society's purpose with companies. Shareholder value has only been able to thrive because company law does not say clearly what the purpose of companies is. And finally, we should encourage or require companies to seek input from actors who have a stake in the company's long-term success. We may be talking here about employee participation, whether this is the employee's right to give an opinion on pay, ranging all the way up to employees' right to participate at board level. But there's room here for experimentation. It's only through involvement of long-term actors with a long-term interest that the long-term interest of companies can be identified. And I'd like to finish by emphasising that the EU has a long tradition in corporate governance regulation of using processes and possibilities rather than mandating outcomes. And I would say that the EU's new approach to corporate governance should be willing to experiment with multiple inputs from multiple actors using regulation, soft law and encouragement. And if you want to read the full paper, links are on the PowerPoint now. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much for your well-argued criticism to the, let's say, existing draft of the Shareholder Directive. As I said before, it's always a little bit dangerous to put an academic in the end of the panel, but I would say I put you in the proper basket because you did it very well. I noticed here for our debate, maybe because this was the third time that it was said that the remuneration, say on pay, should be linked also to non-financial issues, which is obvious to do so. And the question to the speakers here would be, to the Commission, but also to the Parliament rapporteur, would be any space for having an alternative approach as you propose here? Is this possible anymore to go straight on with another setting, with another word, as you propose. So this is, for me, that's an open question at this state of the discussion.